the fifth kind. This video is in association with Gaia.com. Go to Gaia.com/fifth kind for access to thousands of thought-provoking documentaries and original programs. Follow the links in the description below.
The Nazca lines are still being revealed. Only recently, Japanese scientists discovered another 70 images in the Nazca Desert by using drone technology. It is very possible that the knowledge of our relationship to the stars existed much earlier and was transmitted to the people of Nazca.
Je pense que le territoire irakien comporte de nombreuses portes stellaires.
I believe there are many stellar gateways on the Iraqi territory. Gods could travel through stellar gates like the ones that we see in Stargate. I think this is the reason behind the problems that occur there.
Irak, parce qu'on sait très bien qu'aujourd'hui, malheureusement, toutes les roches.
Indeed, we know very well that today, most archaeological studies all over Iraq have come to a halt.
Alors une fois de plus, là on sort un peu du contexte.
Maybe we could find something, the day when it is actually possible to conduct excavations again in Iraq. Once again, we are far from scientific proof. Why would the military, or even the Americans, focus on this particular spot? Are they using stellar portals?
J'en avais longuement discuté avec Jerry Zeitling.
I had a long conversation with Gary Zeitling about this before he passed.
Maintenant, on peut pas le prouver. Bon, maintenant, il faut savoir que Jerry...
There were things he knew that he didn't tell me. His wife had worked for the American Secret Services, and he worked on the SETI project for a long time. He also collaborated a little with NASA.
Mais le fait qu'ils se focalisent autant et qu'ils
But the fact that they got involved in and supported my work so much over several years makes me believe there is some truth to it, or at least that they had access to information which coincided with what I had translated.
Anton Parks' research on the Sumerian cuneiforms not only attracted the attention of those in curious fields, but it also opened new doors at looking at older evidence.
The basis of our modern scholarship on Sumer comes out of the library of Ashurbanipal that was found in Nineveh. And in this area, there were metallic sheets that had patterns and little illustrations etched into them. And there are several illustrations.
In the Sumerian text, there are stories very, very similar of where advanced intelligences were able to move between dimensional realities, and they would do it using a small device that they were able to take and tune in a very precise way to the material of the earth, to the rocks of the earth, that would allow them to do this. So there are other stargates.
Is it possible that, like the ancient mathematical language encoded in the Great Pyramid, these shortcuts to other dimensions were created by the gods as a means to not only travel, but empower human beings to see beyond the veil?
They're beginning to discover that there are many other dimensions, and that these dimensions are only separated from ours by an electromagnetic membrane. In fact, he equates it to a radio frequency. We, as creatures, right now are tuned into this radio frequency. If we could reach in and just turn the dial a little bit, you're going to tune into the next one. And how horrifying might that be, or how beautiful might that be? We don't know really what's existing on those dimensions.
What we do know is in places like the Cairo Museum in Egypt, a number of artifacts have been found from sites such as Saqqara, for example, that scientists simply cannot explain. They're reluctant to even put them on view to the public. Some of them are in back rooms or they're boxed up in the lower levels. They're made of materials that are not from Earth. We don't know what this stuff is.
Could these materials of unearthly origin be proof that these gateways did exist?
Anything referred to as a gate of God or a navel of the earth is usually a sort of an energetic hotspot where the laws of physics are slightly different, or just so, that allows you to step through a portal into another level of existence.
There is one interpretation that would say perhaps there was something going on connecting different planets, different civilizations. And remember, the Sumerian accounts are of jealous gods, essentially, gods who are vying for influence and power.
Could mankind's ability to find these stargates be the next chapter in forwarding our understanding of the multi-dimensional universe we live in?
There's a Stargate believed to be a similar doorway. It's in Turkey. There are others in Egypt. There are others in Iraq. And there are naturally occurring Stargates in the American desert Southwest that the native people talk about.
Places like Gobekli Tepe, or certainly the area around Gobekli Tepe in southeast Turkey, the area around Giza in Egypt, and other places like Stonehenge in England. They form part of what might be described as an Earth grid, and that there were reasons for establishing these places. They all have something in common with each other. And if you ask me what that is, I would probably say that it's geomagnetic anomalies, the appearance of strange light phenomena, what we would call UFOs today, the manifestation of supernatural forms, supernatural entities, and the idea that you can achieve altered states of consciousness more easily at these places than elsewhere.
So there is an elaborate science that I've gone into for many years, which I was analyzing how it is possible that stone monuments can actually function as a portal generator. That in fact, it is a remnant of an advanced technology where even something as simple as a pure stone, if you understand the earth is naturally giving off these bubbles, that will allow you to portal into other realities. Then you have to know where to build the stones, and the stones actually become like a focusing mechanism that capture those bubbles coming up from the Earth's core that are multidimensional and allow you to travel through these portals.
The question is, what are we dealing with? I think it's worth considering some extraordinary possibilities. Amongst them, which actually quantum physicists would not find so extraordinary, that we live in a multidimensional universe. That we're occupying one particular dimension of this universe, but there are many other dimensions which are normally inaccessible to us and inaccessible to our senses, but that can be reached in certain ways. And perhaps the most direct gateway to the realm of the gods is found through the deliberate, targeted, well thought out alteration of consciousness. That seems to me perfectly plausible.
One of the most famous portals, the Bermuda Triangle, is a good representation of how planes and boats simply disappear into another dimension, never to return. Research on this area is quite extensive. But what about other seemingly non-active portals? What kind of physical elements could these hotspots possess that could empower humans or gods to tap into simulated universes?
In that frequency, what you need in order for that to really happen are quartz crystal deposits, very vast quartz crystal deposits. And it just so happens our planet has vast crystal deposits all around the globe. And that, to us, is showing us that this is an area with underlying quartz crystal deposits that are strong enough that they're causing tears in this membrane. And that's the reason why you get such a wide array of phenomenon, all occurring in a very small geographic area.
I think the stargates kind of represent places where the veil thins and that we're able to enter into contact with spirit on an easier level. Now, you can look at these as places within your own soul. You can also look at them as specific places on the earth. I think a lot of cathedrals and ancient monuments and stuff were built on ley line nexus points. So the energy of the earth is very strong in these locations. And also you get people conducting ritual and ceremony and whatnot over a long period of time. The etheric field of the place almost becomes a well-worn pathway back into Eden or the Tree of Life.
If indeed this is true, is there a physical place on Earth that mixes the mythological and science to possibly be the perfect gateway to the gods?
In Peru, near Lake Titicaca, is one of the most beautiful and profound examples of one of these stargates. The local people call it Hyomarka. Hyomarka is a mysterious doorway. It is literally a doorway that goes nowhere, carved into the side of a sandstone cliff near the Bolivian border, just outside of Lake Titicaca in Peru. It is on the Peruvian side.
In fact, the locals call it the Gate of the Gods. It's not something that opens. It's just a shape carved into solid rock. The fantasy is that the heroes at one time walked through this into the land of the gods. We don't see how it could open, but the idea of a stargate, that there is something that could step into some other dimension, or a wormhole would have some kind of starting point and could enter.
The idea of a doorway in general is something that we see a lot. We see these in Egyptian temple walls, for example, where the initiate walks up to the temple wall, there's a doorway, and then there's a solid wall. So the physical body can go no further, and the physical body is left behind in the Egyptian traditions, and it is the energy body or the soul that moves through the doorway. What sets Hyomarka apart from those stargates that we see in places like Egypt is that it is believed to be a stargate where the physical body moves in its entirety through the door, in and out of the door, and that it is active today. The Quechuan people are the local native indigenous people from this part of the world, and they tell the story of when the explorers, the Spanish conquerors, came into South America, and when they came into the high Andes, and they tried to convert the local people to Catholicism and under Spanish rule, and the local indigenous people resisted. And they were chased across the Andes. And the last one, the last emperor, is said to have come to this place near the edge of Lake Titicaca and stepped up onto this stargate. And with a device that he held in his hand, he placed it into a notch that is in the wall. And when he turned it, he began walking, and he walked right through the wall.
Could this be the same device that the Sumerians are depicted using in earlier cuneiforms? If so, how did it work?
What the local people say today, they tell me, is that it is an active stargate. There are certain times of year that their ancestors continue to pass in and out. They continue to pass through this gate. Now, as a geologist, the most striking thing about the geology of Hyomarka is that it is a high quartz sandstone, and it's a very special kind of quartz called piezoelectric quartz. Now, if you have a watch that says it's a quartz watch, that is a piezoelectric crystal that is in the watch. By compressing that crystal with a spring just a little bit, it releases an electrical and a magnetic charge that drives the watch on a small scale. That principle applies on larger scales as well. We're looking at an area, a geographic area, that is under pressure releasing electricity the way that that spring and the little quartz would in our watch. And if there were a place where such a phenomenon could happen, the time travel and the ability to move between dimensions is directly linked to magnetic fields and electrical fields. So this place is already a high-stressed field because of the piezoelectricity. And mathematically, it makes perfect sense that under certain conditions, certain planetary alignments, when the magnetic field combines with that electrical field to produce an effect, that we could see something like a Stargate effect, just like we see in the laboratory. When we look at what has happened at Hyomarka and the principles that are involved there and parallels in other civilizations, it begins to tell a bigger story.
I would not be able to back this up with evidence if I were to say there were a physical portal that transported us physically into other dimensions. But is there a portal that can lead our consciousness into other dimensions and to, in a non-physical state, to interact with the inhabitants of those dimensions? The curiosity is that you can go into shamanistic cultures today, for example, amongst South American Indians in the Amazon basin, who are using ayahuasca, and you can find that the shamans, after they have come back from the ayahuasca journey, recall the imagery that they experienced in the altered state of consciousness, and they paint that imagery. And lo and behold, the paintings contain the same elements to paintings that were done 33,000 years ago in Chauvet Cave in France. How do we explain this, and what can we learn from this? What those shamans in the Amazon tell us very clearly is that in the ayahuasca journey, they encounter teachers who teach them how to live and how to function in the world. So the question is, where were those teachers? Are they the inhabitants of other dimensions, of parallel dimensions that coexist? Are they perhaps aware of us when we're not aware of them? And were they finding some way to reach out to us and to teach us what we needed to know? That would be a true gateway of the gods that we're dealing with here. These are vehicles for crossing that space, physical vehicles for crossing the space between dimensions. Maybe that's what's going on here, and the technology allows consciousness to cross that space much more easily and allows humanity to learn the lessons that those denizens of other dimensions have to teach us.
Cette localisation de cette fameuse montagne divine.
We were able to locate the divine mountain of the Anuna gods along with their Garden of Eden, thanks to the elements found with Google Earth and Gary Zeitling from NASA. It took us straight to eastern Turkey, close to Road 5651. What can be noted in the Sumerian tablets, when they clearly speak of creating workers to serve the Anunas, the main geneticist is always Enki. Enki is very proud of what he is doing. However, he always has to do it in secret. And here something important occurs in the research that I've carried out. In order to be able to secretly teach values, besides from changing their genetic code, in which he probably injected things that we cannot comprehend nowadays, the gods were using a specific language in Eden, the Emian language, the language that comes from the skies, the language which comes from On. In my years of research, I understood that the Emeshah, the matrix language, was mostly used by Sumerian priestesses. The so-called Emeshah contained more particles than the languages used by the male gods. So Enki used the Emeshah, the matrix language, to encode the ancient languages we find on Earth. I think that Enki had the desire to work for the benefit of the human race, to secretly bring them knowledge. And to be able to do that, they had to use a code. So they created a linguistic code for each tribe. And I think that regularly, maybe every generation, they had to change the code to prevent the Anunas from finding out about the hidden knowledge.
It is interesting to note that according to Anton's research, the language that has been coded into the universe for the humans to speak is called the matrix language. In Sumerian, this means the language that the female life creators, like Tiamat, spoke. How has this coded language helped us survive against the wrath of the demiurge?
This is a crucial part of my work. I discovered that all common languages were coded from Sumerian. We can look for idioms from anywhere we want. African tribes, Native American tribes, all the way to China. When you get to the innermost part of primitive languages, you can always understand the words in Sumerian. For example, if you take the word tool in the language of an African tribe and you translate it into Sumerian, it will become the thing we use to chop wood. The idea is a code used in order to be able to communicate secretly with humans. In concrete terms, this idea of coding language and creating new ones with Sumerian syllables, this desire to be able to communicate secretly with the human race, is going to design the many different languages on Earth. Old Chinese, the Hopi, many of the ancient idioms we find in Africa or in Australia. We can find common roots with ancient German and ancient English. Enki knew for a fact that human beings would not be submissive to the gods on the whole planet. So he gifted them with the ability to make tools, and in my theory, he also wished to code human language so the gods could not understand.
Anton Parks suggests that once the humans had the knowledge to survive on Earth, they sought to build their own future and escape the gods. Could there be an actual builder of this new human settlement? In the Hebrew Bible, it suggests that the builder of the Tower of Babel was the king of Shinar, and his name was Nimrod. What an interesting name for someone who defies the laws of Yahweh to create his own connection to the Creator. Could Nimrod have been the representation of the first group of humans to use the knowledge taught by Enki?
Nimrod, interesting character. He was said to have built the Tower of Babel. He went up against God himself, tried to get closer than anybody else had ever done. As a result, God struck down the Tower of Babel, and as a punishment to humanity for having attempted this act, confused the languages so that everybody couldn't understand everybody else. Is there anything more behind this story? Is there something of importance? Well, what is the Tower of Babel? And the Babylonian civilization is focused around Babylon, and Babylon is in Lower Iraq. They now see this area as the center of reality, the center of everything. This is the omphalos, the axis mundi, the axis of the earth. That gravitational shift from northern Mesopotamia to southern Mesopotamia was the result of the Babylonians. This is why the ancient city of Erech is in southern Iraq, when all the old accounts say that it was the ancient name for Urfa in southeast Turkey. This is why Nimrod is associated now with Babylon and not with southeast Turkey.
The biblical story of Nimrod and his area of proposed reign happened to be in the same area that a group of ancient astrologers once resided. This group was called the Chaldeans. Could this ancient group have been practicing some of the ancient teachings by Enki?
Urfa was the stronghold of Nimrod. This was the traditional homeland of the Chaldeans. They were star worshippers. They recorded the stars. They had knowledge of the comets, knowledge of eclipses and everything like this. They were the scientists of their day. So what Abraham is trying to do is knock down their beliefs, their ideas, their mystery tradition, and install this new idea. So it is possible that what he was trying to do is to essentially kill off the wisdom tradition that had been that of the Chaldeans up to this point, and that Nimrod somehow steps in, whoever or whatever he represents, to try and prevent this from happening. But unfortunately, according to the legends, God intervenes, saves Abraham, and that's essentially the story. So yes, there is something in this. I do accept that what Abraham was trying to do is, bring in a new era that didn't need our connection with the stars. But what the implications of that is for Judaism or even Christianity, I don't know.
Could this battle between Abraham and Nimrod really be representing a battle between Enki and Enlil for the control over the human race?
What the Mesopotamian story tells us that Enki introduced contention into human speech. And there are biblical scholars who think that that was the basis then of the Tower of Babel story. Now, what's interesting though is earlier Enki was said to be the provider of wisdom. He was said to have been the one who wanted humanity to have the knowledge that would undo the gods or the control of the gods. So we have this kind of conflict now in the Mesopotamian stories. People who have really studied the Mesopotamian stories, and we're talking very good biblical scholars and Mesopotamian scholars, they're so ambivalent about the Enki figure. They say, yeah, he was said to be this great guy. He sometimes is identified with the snake in the Garden of Eden, and then he later became identified with Prometheus in the Greek version of the story, where Prometheus tries to come down and give humanity the certain knowledge that would advance them. And then the other gods come in and say, no, you can't do that. And then there are all these repercussions to humanity in dividing them up. The people in the Tower of Babel story were really anarchists who were opposing the archons. And they were saying, the heck with the archons, we're leaving, we're going to establish our own little anarchy, and we're going to move over here and build our own city, and we're going to go do things on our own.
And what was it that they were going to do their way? Just 8 miles north of the ancient city of Urfa is another famous site known as Gobekli Tepe. All that is revealed is the top of what could have been a great tower of sorts. 95% of the site remains below ground to be uncovered. Could the ancient humans have gathered here to use their knowledge of the universe?
Gobekli Tepe is the oldest stone circle complex in the world. If you can imagine Stonehenge in England and transpose it onto the top of a mountaintop in southeast Turkey, and then multiply it by at least 20 times, and then cover the stones with beautiful carvings of animals and representations of abstract humans, and give them T-shaped tops. The fact is that Gobekli Tepe is in northern Mesopotamia. This is clearly the cradle of civilization in this area. This is where the Neolithic Revolution began. This is where even the archaeologist Klaus Schmidt at Gobekli Tepe, who discovered the site, suggests that the Anunnaki had their power base. It's clearly that a lot of things started here.
A site only becomes sacred upon the foundations of many, many old temples. Gobekli Tepe is one great example. It's an entire artificial hill. The clue is actually in the name, the original name. It means Potbelly Hill, or the Hill of the Navel, in its true context, which to me tells me that it's a navel of the earth, and like so many other navels of the earth around the world, it's a place where the rules of physics work in a certain way that allows you communication with other levels of reality.
The whole evolution of language in the human Homo sapien sapien brain has been cultivated, manipulated, and managed by technologies that could influence the human brain's development of language. And that when we read about the Tower of Babel being a time when the human population had one language, had one thought system, if it's true that there have been competing geopolitical territorial forces of competing non-humans on this planet, and that there was a time when humans were unified, that would not have been a good step for the competing non-humans. And it could very well be the Tower of Babel story was one of those moments where humans had been homogenized and something did not want that homogeneity in human thought, humans together, humans working as a group. And that from the outside, there was a disruption in what, for just a brief moment, may have been a unification in thought without war or conflict of human beings.
Unification, a dangerous thing to have if you plan to rule over a people. But could this unification have been an actual tower, or just an ancient location where people gathered to exchange knowledge? A location in which they could communicate important information.
Babylon is actually an old Sumerian word which means gate of God, which for me, in my understanding of the ancient mysteries, tells me everything I need to know. Anything referred to as a gate of God or a navel of the earth is usually a sort of an energetic hotspot where the laws of physics are slightly different, or just so, that allows you to step through a portal into another level of existence. For me, the Tower of Babel essentially represents the levels of attainment of knowledge that gets you to rise slowly ever upwards towards the mind of God. The summit, of course, being the connection or the interchange between the physical and the non-physical. The way that they communicated in the old days was through metaphor, and the more we get into the historical era, the more we mistake the metaphor for reality.
In one of the traditions, Enlil just gets really annoyed because of the noise humanity's making. And that just noise is too much. Let's just get rid of these horrible little things. But Enki doesn't want to go that route. Humanity are his creatures, and his project is to bring wisdom and understanding to humanity. And I think there's a beautiful message hidden beneath that symbolism.
When it comes to exploring Native American lore, and in particular legends about the underworld, the Four Corners area is particularly important because we have a number of Native American groups that claim to have emerged there. And by that I mean they have an emergence myth that says that they came out of the earth. The Pueblo people believed that they had come out of the earth in that area, around the Grand Canyon area. We have the Hopi, who claim they came out of what they call the Sipapu, which is basically the name for a little hole as part of their chimney system in Akiva. But they claim that they had to come out of something they called the Sipapu, and they had come out of the underworld, where they had interacted with reptilian humanoids called the snake people and the lizard people. And they had also interacted with another group called the ant people. The ant people are described basically in a way that sounds very much like so-called descriptions of modern-day gray aliens. We have this whole idea here that there's a series of worlds beneath, and they all have their own inhabitants, and that these Native American people said they had come up through these various regions to eventually emerge in our world. We have the Apache, who have a similar legend that says they came through a series of caverns to our world after they lived in a place called the Old Fireland, which had been destroyed in a cataclysm and had sunk beneath the ocean. And they claimed that they had come here through a series of caverns, just as the Aztecs said. We also have the Navajo, and the Navajo believe that they came out of the underworld as well. So these are themes that all tie into the Four Corners area, and it's very interesting that the various people, some of them were even adversaries in previous centuries, that they all have similar legends about worlds within our world.
If the premise that modern mankind originated from caverns deep below the earth is true, then is it also possible that there are entire civilizations still living underground in the Four Corners region?
I live near Taos, New Mexico, and there is a phenomenon that is called the hum, the Taos Hum, H-U-M. It is a vibration that is felt selectively by some people. Other people don't seem to know it at all. It usually happens between 2 and 4 a.m. when a lot of people are sleeping. And the hum, it's right on the verge of where you feel it in your heart and where you can just below the audible level. And no one knows where this hum is coming from. They brought in university researchers back in the 1980s to try to triangulate where, if they could find 3 locations where they found the hum and triangulate, they could find the source. And what they found was that it's coming from everywhere, suggesting that there is a vibration happening within the earth during those periods of time, 2, 3, 4 a.m., that is being carried through the bedrock into these other areas. What is the source of that vibration? This is where the speculation comes in, that these natural tunnels and the caves and the caverns that our ancestors have talked about in the past that already exist are being modified, perhaps, and used in modern ways for storage, for earth sensing, geosensing applications, and things like that. So that is where the scientific community kind of has arrived, is that there is something, they think maybe it is the drilling, the constant drilling to modify these caverns that's creating the vibration.
Since 1946, the U.S. government has been using Hopi land in the Four Corners region for explosive testing. Is it possible that, in fact, these tests are a cover-up? Could the military be using the ancient power of this area to run covert military programs? Or could their true agenda be to destroy something that was discovered underground, perhaps something from an ancient galaxy? Billy Carson entails his personal encounter at the Four Corners area.
It appears that a lot of this activity and a lot of these tunnels congregate close to this Four Corners area. Now, there's well-known stone-based stargates, is what the ancient Indians call them, and now the modern Indians are saying these are where their relatives used to go and put their heads in and actually chant some words and disappear. And then some of them will return. Last summer, I went to Arizona to see the Grand Canyon. We actually hired a helicopter and a guide to go down there because I wanted to find out if I can see any of these ancient mysteries that people have been talking about. And we landed on this Indian reservation down inside the canyon. And there's a special area that was cordoned off. So I said to the guy, I said, why can't I come over here? I don't understand. I don't see anything dangerous. He said, because NASA has taken over this part of the canyon.
The way the grid system runs across the Earth, there are several places that are just like heavily energetic nodes. You'll find on many reservations and other holy areas held by natives, you will find that military groups have gone in and built facilities and made them off limits. A lot of the time, these are actual entrances into this cavern system that honeycombs the entire Earth. A lot of these places are sacred to natives because they have stories going back many millennia of different types of beings taking them below the Earth before cataclysms to protect them. And these same beings, after the cataclysm, would bring them back to the surface of the Earth and help them set up their civilizations again. A lot of these areas that the military will lock down also are very strong vortexes, which basically are nodes in this cosmic web Stargate system. These are places that the military want locked down because they don't want you to see what's coming and going through these gates.
A lockdown? If this is true, who or what could possibly be traveling through these gates or in these underground caverns? Perhaps we should consider one of the less conventional theories of evolution. If it is possible that the DNA of human beings was originally bioengineered by ancient terrestrials, could this be a link? William Bramley points out how this idea is explained in Hopi folklore.
You have this possibility, at least within the lore. You don't necessarily exclude skyborn gods from gods that lived underground because people had both ideas, that the gods had realms underground, underwater, and in the sky, and they interacted with all of them. We already know there are very large caverns here and there. It may be, for example, that the South American tribe, maybe the Hopi, maybe they found some of these at one time, or at least they found caverns big enough where they believe that some of these things could transpire. So it's not necessarily a contradiction. It just means that the gods operated in these different realms.
When we look at the creation stories of our past, as different as they are from one another, there are common themes that weave them all together. I find this fascinating because it is the local understanding of a common heritage, I believe, that is preserved in the traditions of the modern indigenous peoples. One of the most obvious of these common threads is the theme of another world beneath this one, a subterranean world from which our ancestors emerged.
A lot of these themes from Native American folklore have found their way into modern day accounts of what I call modern folklore, which would be ufology, cryptozoology, all these types of things, conspiracy literature. Really, all this stuff is just an update of folklore. It's the same stuff that people have done for centuries. Sometimes it contains truth, sometimes it contains fabrications, sometimes people elaborate on what they think something means. But we see these ideas of underworlds involved with variety of peoples around the world now emerging in these same areas. All these things touch on this same type of material.
With these subterranean creation stories of the world from which our ancestors emerged, is there perhaps a code or a treasure that could have been left for us to figure out the truth of humanity's connections to the four corners?
New Mexico, Arizona, the whole area around the Four Corners, and Utah, of course, and southern Colorado, it's actually one of the most spiritually active parts of North America. And this is why that part of America is so, it draws so many people. Some of them might know it, some of them don't, but they are drawn there nevertheless. I think it's because the land is worked with. The land is a living organism. If you work with it, just like watering a plant, it gives you something back. It gives you back a certain pleasure, and that's what you're attracted to. So that's why that part of the country is so important, because it's still alive. It's worked with on a daily basis, and you can feel that as you just drive through it. There is the Navajo sites, there is Mesa Verde as well, there is Bandelier, there's a kiva up on Bandelier that if you happen to go there at the end of the day and time it so you don't get caught up inside the park, you have to climb up a 100-foot ladder. And that place is perfectly positioned inside the natural cave in a really awkward area of the park, because that's the one spot where the Earth's telluric currents just happen to cross. You know, and they're everywhere. These currents are everywhere. But they built this sacred site exactly where those currents cross, and you go inside the kiva, and you have this out-of-body experience, because this energy is made of the same stuff that we're made of. It's literally just giving you a means, a technology in which to escape the physical world and connect to another level of reality.
Gregg Braden takes us deep into another structure in the Four Corners area that may give us an insight into how this location connects to the sky and what may lie below.
One of the greatest mysteries that we're finding of ancient civilization is right in our own backyard for those of us that live in the United States, in the high deserts of northern New Mexico, Chaco Canyon. Something happened in Chaco Canyon 1,100 plus years ago that we have never seen in the history of the world before, and we never saw duplicated since that time. We still do not know precisely who the people were that built Chaco Canyon, where they came from, why they had the advanced technology, why they had the mathematics, why they had the astronomy, the architecture, the ability to grow food in one of the most harshest environments. It's 12 miles long, 2 miles wide in some places. Within the canyon itself, there are over 2,800 archaeological sites that have been recognized. Of those 2,800, 32 have been excavated, and because they cannot be sustained, many of them were reburied to preserve them for later generations. 12 are now restored, and it's those 12 that are telling the story, that is opening the door to forbidden territory when it comes to archaeology, advanced civilizations of our past. One of the most notable places in Chaco Canyon is Pueblo Bonito. It is a very unique D-shaped architectural complex. Over 900 rooms were built into this Pueblo Bonito. Some of them are square, some of them are the circular chambers, the kivas, that play such a significant role in the traditions of the native peoples throughout the desert Southwest. And one of the reasons that this circular chamber is so important is because it ties directly into their creation story. In the circular chambers, in the kivas, there was a place at one end of the kiva called the sipapu. And the sipapu, in the native traditions, is where our ancestors from the past emerged from another world beneath this world. They emerge into this world time and time again. This ties in beautifully to some of the creation stories that we find everywhere from Sumeria to the Mesoamerican traditions in the Yucatan. There's a common theme that runs through all of these stories, and that common theme is that the people emerge from a world that is underneath, it is below the world that we know now.
Is this yet another reference to human creation beneath the surface? What might be Chaco Canyon's connection to the stars?
When the Viking missions began sending back the images from Mars, over 19,000 images from the orbiter as it was circling. And as those images now have been refined and we have a better sense of what they are, lo and behold, there is on the surface of Mars a temple complex that looks precisely like an unexcavated Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, the very unique D-shaped structure that we find nowhere else on this planet in the past, It's nothing that we find contemporary. The only other place we find an example of this structure is on the surface of Mars. Now, the people of Chaco Canyon, we don't know, as I mentioned, precisely who they are, but we know that they had an advanced understanding of physics, of astronomy and mathematics. There's a place in Chaco, a 400-foot tall butte called Fajada Butte. And at the top of Fajada Butte is a mysterious structure that scientists are now calling the North American Stonehenge. Now, you wouldn't necessarily know that to look at it because there are 3 vertical slabs made of the same material as the native Earth. In the 1970s, it was recognized that on the solstice and on the equinox, the way the sun comes and the light shines through these slabs against a spiral design on the wall at the back of the slabs, it actually pinpoints precisely the summer solstice and the equinox, as well as lunar cycles. And this was something that has never been seen before. It's so rare that scientists were reluctant to even embrace the possibility that it was actually happening. And it was only when laser-guided imagery was used to mimic the solstices and the equinoxes at different times of year that scientists were able to pinpoint precisely that, yes, this is what was happening on Fajada Butte.
All species tend to transcend into something else sooner or later. This is the process of evolution and natural selection, which some people find very annoying. But I see no mileage in saying evolution doesn't happen. You need species to have the ability to bounce back from assaults. For example, if you have a giant asteroid or comet hit the Earth and make life on Earth extremely fragile and tenuous, you need to be able to bounce back from that. In other words, you need to be able to duck and dive and evolve to adapt to the new situations and keep the project of life going. The whole process of evolution is a process of unfolding. Could we become very different from what we are now? Yes, given enough time, given enough new situations to adapt to and develop with.
Could these new situations have included taking refuge within the inner earth?
We have the biblical texts about this notion of giants in the old days, and certainly after the great floods and the great cataclysmic events that may have sunk Atlantis, we can only speculate to say that there could be a breakaway civilization that went underground at the end of the last cataclysm. And these beings, some of whom could be giants, others could look just like us or some similar human to us, could be living inside the earth.
You get the Mayans who kind of disappeared. Like there's speculation they may have ascended, they may have gone to a deeper plane existence that we originally came out of. And same with the Tuatha De Danann in Ireland. Like they're said to be gods or fairies or ancestral spirits, but they were originally people. I also see like a lot of legends where people coming out of the sea and coming out of the earth may tie into the Atlantis myth where we've come from deeper planes of ontology. Because a lot of time the underworld does represent a deeper plane of existence.
Anton Parks' research indicates that the underworld can also be linked to creation.
In ancient texts, in Gnostic, Sumerian, even Egyptian texts, the abyss is always linked to the process of creation. So we find this recurrent theme of the abyss. And through the research that I have done, I found out that Enki is the master of the abyss, of the great deep, which also, in some ways, corresponds to the underworld.
If you go back to the Mesopotamian creation stories, they talked about gods from the sky basically bioengineering a form of humanity that was already here, creating that more modern form. But they don't necessarily say that the engineering was done in the sky. For example, Enki was also the god of the underwater realms. So there was a possibility that maybe there was some realm underwater or underground where some of this activity was being conducted. And so you have this possibility, at least within the lore. You don't necessarily exclude skyborn gods from gods that lived underground, because people had both ideas, that the gods had realms underground, underwater, and in the sky, and they interacted with all of them.
Indeed, the further back you go in history, the more you are faced with giants, just like prehistoric animals on Earth. For example, the dinosaurs. Roughly, I would say that if Enki is about 6 feet 5 inches, closer to human, On and the other Sumerian gods and goddesses, by the way they were portrayed, I would say are about 11 feet 5 inches, between 10 feet and 11 feet 5 inches, maybe even up to 14 feet.
If some of the Sumerian gods were suggested to be giant in size, how would this relate to myths of an underworld in South America? Sonia Grace uses her alternative research to connect the dots on the underground mythology in Mesopotamia.
When I first spirit traveled to the Ziggurat of Ur, I was really amazed because there was a very small structure, like a temple, made out of stone. And the ant people, who I call the Savroks, were all over the land. They were everywhere. And one of them came up to me, and these are ginormous ants. These are not, little ants or people that look like, they're ants. And they came up to me and they said, we created this place in the beginning, and this is what we built for the people of Atlantis, so that when Atlantis fell, they had a place to go to. We helped them to safety. And they said, we want to take you and show you this place. So we went through this little opening and we started going down and further into this long tunnel. It went on forever. And then all of a sudden it opened out into this beautiful, huge cavern. There were all kinds of rocks and crystals and stones in the walls. There was a lake, and it went on into further caverns. It was enormous. And they said, this is where we led the people who did survive and got out of Atlantis before it fell. And at the top of the cave were these roots from a big tree that was coming down. And they said that when the people were there, they referred to this place as Eden. It was the place that they had that was their refuge, that saved them. So they referred to it and called it Eden. And when the world came back and life was happening on the surface again, in the roots of the tree that were coming down from the top of the cave, they could see greenery coming out and growing, so they knew it was okay to come back up to the surface. And when they came back up, they referred to this tree as the tree of life.
If the underworld is not only a place of creation, might it also have been a place to hide? In the Hebrew Bible, the Nephilim were the sons of gods mingling with the daughters of Adam. They were also known as giants and considered to be the fallen ones. Michael Mott's research suggests that they might have retreated underground. Are these the giants described in ancient texts?
Some people say that these giants are pre-Adamites, which means they came about before Adam and Eve. Some say that they are Nephilim, which would mean they are part human and part fallen angel. And this is a theme that does find a reflection in some of the Native American lore, because the giants are described as having 6 fingers, 6 toes, double rows of teeth. Occasionally they have horns. And this ties right in with the ancient description of the Nephilim, for instance, from the Book of Enoch and other sources, and even from the Old Testament. So this is something that we see again and again. They fled a cataclysm, they fled something they fear, so they go beneath the earth and they claim that they live much longer by living there. There's just plenty of water. There are strange areas where there seems to be a lot of high pressure, which blow out a lot of breathable air. And that's not to say that you wouldn't have to have a really advanced level of not just civilization, but technology in order to carve out a space inside the crust of the planet and to make a sustainable environment there.
What became of the gods? I'm not sure that I can give an answer to this question. Maybe that the survivors, the ones that could still be alive in our solar system, live underground on Earth.
There are many reports that these giants moved inside the Earth, into the inner Earth. According to my information, it is a honeycomb of caverns inside the Earth, and there are many groups living inside. Groups that are non-terrestrial, groups that left the surface of the Earth many, many millennia ago and just never came back out.
Has any evidence been discovered that can prove the existence of a lost underground civilization? Historians have been debating this for centuries. Perhaps the answer to this question lies deep in the Amazon jungle, 2,500 miles south of Belize. An indigenous tribe known as the Makushi have lived here with little contact from the outside world until the mid-18th century, and yet their mythology is almost identical to beings who protect the hollow earth described by the Mayans.
You have that South American tradition, which is very interesting, of the tribe that said that they were guarding the entrance to the inner earth. And they said it would take maybe a couple of weeks to finally get down far enough where they would meet the inhabitants, and they were just these gigantic people, anywhere between 10 and 11.5 feet tall. So, of course, the common idea is that, oh, this is just a bunch of mythology by a primitive people. But what's interesting is they talked about how when they got far enough down, one of the things they saw was basically molten rock. And that's exactly what modern science tells us you should find underneath the earth. And how would a primitive people know that? There are also areas where there's all this lush plants and food and the people living down there. Can we take that seriously? We're left with this very interesting myth that has a few intriguing elements to it. It's worth a look if we can get down there.
The Mahaxi Indians of Guyana and also of the northern Amazon basin have a very interesting legend concerning an entrance to the inner earth. And according to their legend, there is an entrance to the underworld there. And at one point, they were in charge of security over the entrance to this location. And according to their legend, they could descend into this world and come into contact with the very tall men who were basically giants, 15 feet tall, 12 feet tall. And they had been given this task of guarding this location and the entrance and not letting anyone else enter.
Traveling for 15 days down into this cavern until they literally put down their torches, because there's these inner balls of light that will light you the rest of the way on steps that are 33 inches long. Eventually making it into caverns where food was growing, lit by 4 large sun-like discs that they couldn't even stare at, they were so bright. And they describe the food as being apples the size of a human head, grapes the size of a human fist, interacting with giant beings that they described as being 3 to 4 meters in height, who would catch giant fish for them and give it to them as a gift. That kind of detail coming from a culture who didn't have any access to libraries, didn't have any access to television, satellite, internet. How is it that they come across or begin to tell stories that are being duplicated in all these other cultures? There has to be some truth to it. Now, whether it's completely hollow inside or whether or not these vast caverns are just there, I believe that they're there. And a lot of people believe that they're inhabited by what we would describe as being an alien species, an ultra-terrestrial species rather than an extraterrestrial species.
Could these strange species be linked to the Sumerian gods? Many of these stories about a lost civilization under the earth from indigenous cultures around the world have strong similarities. Is it possible that these giant creatures were the sages described in ancient Sumerian texts and others? And did these beings bring back humanity after a cataclysm?
In Sumerian tradition and in the surviving texts that have been passed down to us, There is a very strong and intriguing reference to what are called the 7 antediluvian sages. Go over to India, and we have the 7 rishis. So this number keeps on cropping up. We can go further away to Easter Island, and there we discover an ancient tradition that civilization was first brought to Easter Island by 7 initiated men. Now, how are we to take all of this, and how can we put it into some kind of context? For me, what I think we're looking at is more evidence that there was a high civilization that we have lost track of, that we truly are a species with amnesia, and that we have forgotten a very important part of our story. And fragments of that story crop up all around the world. What I think we're looking at is an outreach program reaching out to the hunter-gatherers in what we would call the Upper Paleolithic, and beginning to teach certain of them selected skills, giving them the gifts of civilization. But to find this theme again and again and again, the 7 sages, the 7 wise men, teaching the gifts of civilization, I would say we are looking at symbolic allusions towards the outreach of a lost civilization.
But who are these beings we have lost touch with?
I wish we could get into the minds and into the heads of the people who made these sites all over the world in megalithic structures, that they're all concerned with lining themselves up to the rising point of the sun at certain times of the year. They're telling us something about our connection to the cosmos and our place on Earth.
Could Gobekli Tepe, the oldest megalithic structure on the planet, be revealing a code that would connect us not only to this anomaly in the sky, but also to other ancient sites around the world? Translated into English, Gobekli Tepe means pot-bellied hill. In 1994, Klaus Schmidt, an archaeologist from Germany, began digging into this unnatural-looking bluff. A few feet below the surface, he discovered stone ruins. Further investigation revealed that this ancient formation in southern Turkey was 7,000 years older than Stonehenge, throwing into question much of what has been written in the history books. Klaus Schmidt dedicated his life's work to uncovering what might lie below the surface and continued to excavate until he, mysteriously, died in 2014. 95% of the ruins are still buried, and the true purpose of Gobekli Tepe and its relationship to the galaxy is still an unsolved mystery.
Most archaeologists believe the site is about 13,000 years old, and they believe it existed for a couple of thousand years, and then it was deliberately buried. Now, as far as I'm concerned, it could date back much further than that, because there is evidence in Turkey that humans like us existed millions of years ago.
Gregg Braden points out that more evidence is being uncovered, pushing back the date of antiquity. Could Gobekli Tepe be even older?
One of the consequences of global warming is that the ice on the poles has receded tremendously, including Antarctica, and the thickness of the ice as it is reduced allows greater visibility from Earth-penetrating radar, so we can see what's underneath the ice. But one of the surprises is that the satellite images are sending back now what appear to be large-scale, complex archaeological sites. So they're not small hunting villages and pit houses. These look like advanced technological civilizations that we're seeing underneath the ice. So as a scientist, I have to say one of two things happened. Either someone built these complex structures under the ice after it already formed, which is less likely, and the more likely scenario is that the structures existed and then the ice covered them. Right now, civilization, the date is being pushed back to 13,500 years. The last ice age ended 12,000 years ago. The historic context of civilizations going back 50, 60, 70,000 years along these 5,000-year cycles shows up in the mythology. Maybe the mythology is based on much more fact than we've been led to believe in the past, or we've been willing to embrace in the past.
If indeed it could be older than mainstream scientists believe, then what could be its purpose?
Gobekli Tepe is the oldest stone circle complex in the world. If you can imagine Stonehenge in England and transpose it onto the top of a mountaintop in southeast Turkey, and then multiply it by at least 20 times, and then cover the stones with beautiful carvings of animals and representations of abstract humans, and give them T-shaped tops, because that's what the stones have there. This is what Gobekli is. It was constructed at the very end of the last ice age, around 9,500 BC, and was in use for a period of around 1,500 years before it was abandoned, about 8,000 BC. What's so interesting is that the oldest and the most accomplished of technologically advanced stone enclosures, and that alone gives us evidence of possibly a lost civilization. The fact is that Gobekli Tepe is in northern Mesopotamia. The area around Urfa and Haran and Gobekli Tepe, this is clearly the cradle of civilization. This is where the Anunnaki had their power base.
I am on a trip with geologist Robert Schoch, who had his PhD in Yale University, and we are standing down inside of the excavation at Gobekli Tepe, surrounded by these 19-foot tall limestone pillars, each weighed up to 15 tons, and they're in rings. And in that process of standing there and talking about this is the most baffling place. It doesn't feel like anything that humans can understand. Robert Schoch said, I've been staring at these T structures and thinking about the old past and what could this have been built for? And he said, all of these limestone pillars have T tops. And he said, it reminds me of tuning forks. And he said, Linda, when you stand up at the top of the hill and you realize that Gobekli Tepe was built in a bowl, you're always looking down at the top of these big T pillars unless you climb down into, and then you're among them. And he said, what if this whole place was built to resonate with certain frequencies by something above, resonating frequencies on big pillars put in rings?
When you look at Gobekli Tepe and you see all of the constructions of the inscriptions of all of the animals of the earth on these giant pillars, it's always been interesting to me that perhaps what these things were a way of recording a standing wave pattern of a certain kind of a life form. For instance, a crocodile exists on a different standing wave pattern than a crane, than an elephant, than a monkey. And perhaps what they were trying to do was, out of a state of preservation, trying to preserve these things. They were trying to preserve stones that actually had those frequencies recorded into them.
Could Gobekli Tepe have been an ancient portal constructed to communicate with gods in faraway galaxies? Is it possible that Tabby's star could be a signal for humans to pay attention to this gateway?
There is, for example, evidence of very clear, very precise astronomy at Gobekli Tepe. It contains, amongst other things, the world's first perfectly north-south aligned building. You can't do that without astronomy. There are alignments to specific star groups and specific moments of the year. It's a highly evolved site.
Shamanic cultures right the way across the Eurasian continent saw the northern celestial pole as the point of exit from the physical world and the point of entry into the sky world. And it was seen as a whole, quite literally a hole connecting the different universes, the middle world to the upper world. It would seem as if this stone is a signboard showing that journey and the actual course, the route that you would take to reach the sky world. I believe that one of the indicators to our earliest ancestors of a place of great power was the appearance of mysterious lights. It's known that a lot of strange light phenomena is seen in those very mountains where Gobekli Tepe is sighted. We call them UFOs today, but these type of phenomena have been occurring for many, many thousands of years, arguably since the beginning. I think that our ancestors would have seen these as important signs that here were places where you could establish points of contact, portals if you like, with the other world, and that by building your monuments here, that link with the stars would be stronger. The downloads of information that create civilization would be stronger. Pillar 43 at Gobekli Tepe is a signboard for the shaman who would be achieving altered states of consciousness within the enclosures and then journeying in an astral form to the upper world.
Perhaps a deeper understanding of the relationship of these ancient monuments to Tabby Star and other galaxies is the key to understanding who built them and why.
You know, I've not examined aerial views of Gobekli Tepe, but the fact that some people, some researchers are equating that with a star map that depicts our relationship would be a perfect match for not only the Egyptian culture, but for what we've discovered in the construction of the pyramids themselves and the fact that this harmonic relationship exists between this star. And it could very well be that what that cosmology was meant to encapsulate and describe is this idea that our star is interacting harmonically with these other stellar bodies. And it could be that this ancient extraterrestrial race that came to visit here not only understood that, but are following that as a sort of harmonic map around the universe.
If it is indeed true that Gobekli Tepe is a gateway to other galaxies, then perhaps somehow its architects knew a global catastrophe was imminent and buried this ancient technology to protect it.
As the excavations continued, a number of surprising things began to become clear. First off, this pot-bellied hill and this whole site had not been covered up by natural sedimentation. After being in use for about 1,000 years, it was deliberately buried by whoever was involved with it. This was not some invading army who came in and smashed it up. This was in a kind of preservation. You must envisage teams of hundreds of people with sort of buckets filled with stone and rubble, and they're coming and they're pouring it in on top of the existing stone circles. And they just keep on pouring until every stone circle is covered.
Could the knowledge that has been covered up preserved the mythology from almost every ancient culture?
Gobekli Tepe is a kind of it's like a potpourri of cultures. You see a lot of Sumerian influence. There's a lot of Egyptian symbolism in Gobekli Tepe as well. There's Hindu influence in there as well, Japanese. And the fact is, this is where you start getting to this gray area. Where does it come from? Was there a world's book, a central point where everybody got their ideas from? It seems to me that Gobekli Tepe is almost like a microcosm of so many cultures around the world that supposedly never shared information with each other. And now we begin to realize actually they got around much more than we gave them credit for.
Could the big secret at Gobekli Tepe be the connection of every culture from around the world? And could it have been discovered at the right time to reveal information? There are many who believe uncovering the answers to these questions will transform how we understand ourselves.
I would be lying if I said I knew what was exactly buried at Gobekli Tepe, but I think what you can do is draw a lot of similarities and parallels to some of these other megalithic sites and get some pretty decent scientific insight into what they were trying to accomplish. And what it looks like they were trying to accomplish is the preservation of this scientific knowledge, maybe at a time when there was just such global upheaval that the only way to preserve it was to bury it. Could very well be why they purposely buried the entire site. You're going to construct a megalithic site of that kind of grandeur and scale and put that kind of effort into it, and then you're going to turn around and just bury it. Why would any society do that?
But whoever built Gobekli Tepe, the fact that they buried that very important 30 acres of these rings of all of these limestone columns meant somebody, something knew that something potentially destructive to the whole planet, and they didn't want Gobekli Tepe destroyed. But Gobekli Tepe survived until the 1990s.
Although Gobekli Tepe's discovery in 1990 was groundbreaking, research has been problematic given the dangerous upheaval in the area and the knowledge that still stays buried. But perhaps the discovery of the Tabi star has become a beacon for knowledge still preserved at Gobekli Tepe, pointing us in a direction to uncover some human truths.
I think it is our responsibility to preserve those records that are being destroyed in this cradle of civilization, in the Tigris-Euphrates, in Iraq, in Syria, in Turkey, because they are very intentionally being destroyed in some cases to wipe out the memory of these past civilizations for a number of reasons. But once they're gone forever. And I think it's very sad to see what's happening, and I think it's a wake-up call. We've taken for granted for so long the fact that these records are here and that they exist. We never really considered that they could be destroyed so easily.
When you're reading in a book and you see Homosapiens, that's Homo sapien, it's my understanding Homo sapien is the word for the large group of standing up primates that have started an evolutionary trail from Lucy in Africa about 2 million years ago. But within Homo sapien, there are a whole bunch of models that have included a Neanderthalensis and now Cro-Magnon Homo sapiens sapien.
Andrew Collins has been monitoring the movement of this ancient giant human species and has a different theory.
We can say almost certainly is that because our ancestors interbred with them, that there were hybrids of Denisovans and Homo sapiens that continued their traditions for tens of thousands of years, evolving these ideas and then spreading them into other parts of the Eurasian continent and also into the Americas.
If you go further south to the area around Sumeria, the area around the Black Sea, and to a place where we have some information from, which is the Scythian culture, which not many people talk about, they also were supposed to be claimed to have been older than the Egyptians, and part of their culture wasn't just humanoid, they were also a godly culture, and they were also described as being very tall, almost like giants, again, sometimes with an elongated skull, and they're supposed to be wisdom keepers.
Here is what I think happened. Possibly somewhere in the Altai mountains of southern Siberia around 45,000 years ago. At this time, the area was occupied by the Denisovans. Let's assume that they were extremely tall, very well built. If you can imagine the biggest Russian wrestlers that you can think of, and then cover them in furs and give them wisdom of 200,000 years. That's what we're talking about here. If you can imagine that their race is probably dying out. In other words, their population may not have been so large as it once was, and yet they have this incredible knowledge, this incredible wisdom now. And they get to hear about these new people arriving out of the direction of the setting sun. They're much smaller, they look different, their skin may be slightly different colour, and they know that they're gradually moving eastwards, they're gradually taking over one territory and then the next. They would exploit the resources and just move on. And then one day, these people turn up and there's a first encounter between our own ancestors, Homo sapiens, and the Denisovans. I think if I was a Denisovan at this point, I would be saying, I think our time's up and we have to change our ways. And one of the possibilities is that there was an understanding between the new people and the Denisovans that this ancient wisdom, this ancient knowledge would now be carried into the new world through hybrid descendants. In other words, we would interbreed, and it would be through our descendants, our hybrid descendants, that this ancient wisdom would now be disseminated.
Could this be true? The Siberian fossil remains found in Altai have challenged scientists to re-examine the transformation of human DNA.
There's been an explosion of new information in this field, partly thanks to new genetic sequencing techniques and deep analysis of DNA. And it's clear that the story of the evolution of anatomically modern humans is much more complicated. The DNA breakthrough is we now know that our anatomically modern human ancestors interbred with Neanderthals. So we're a mixture of Neanderthals and the creature that became anatomically modern humans. And then adding further complication to the picture, Denisovan DNA is also found in the anatomically modern human genome. Trace elements in some areas, quite large amounts in others.
The Denisovans passed to us various genes which have been important in our own development. For instance, in the Tibetan Plateau, the Sherpas and the indigenous peoples there, their ability to be able to spend long periods in extremely high altitudes comes from a gene which was inherited, we now know, from the Denisovans. There were other genes as well to do with our appearance, our intellect, our consciousness were also first developed through this idea of this hybridization. There are many modern populations around the world that have high levels of Denisovan DNA within their genes. We're talking about India, Southeast Asia, Java, Australia, Melanesia, Micronesia, various Native American peoples in Canada, in Mexico, also in the northern part of South America, have all got Denisovan DNA. These are all the descendants of the Denisovans.
If Denisovans roamed the Earth for thousands of years, crossbreeding with other sapiens, it could explain how traces of their DNA have been found thousands of miles from Siberia in North America.
It is almost certain that the Denisovans and their hybrid descendants ended up coming into the Americas. Indeed, it's now been found that in several different Native American peoples, Denisovan DNA exists. And this proves that they were the giants of legend and that they are responsible for the human skeletons, the oversized human skeletons that are found in mound complexes all over North America.
I think we're just at the beginning of the process of unraveling the mystery of what all of this means. It's almost heretical to say so in context of modern anthropology, but I think we're going to have to revisit the out of Africa model. It may be that the evolution that led to anatomically modern humans didn't take place entirely in Africa. We're looking at actually a very complicated picture that ultimately results in us. No Denisovans live today. No Neanderthals live today. We are the sole survivors of that intermingling of slightly different and sometimes very different looking but genetically close human species.
If DNA is only part of the puzzle, Freddy Silva suggests looking into the mythology of the giants.
I'm very much of the opinion that ancient myth always holds a large kernel of truth. The myths are so concise, so well developed, so beautifully illustrated. Native Americans talk about the giants roaming the face of the earth as easily as they talk about aliens. For them, it's not a big deal. It's like, well, of course there were, just like there were big lizards here at one point, so why not humans as well? I believe they were telling us something, and that one thing that they keep telling us over and over again is the fact that the Earth is an experimental way station, and it goes through cycles, long cycles.
All over the world, we have accounts of human remains being found that are of giant stature. So, are these Denisovans? Well, we don't know. And the reason why we don't know is because all those found in North America have been repatriated as part of the so-called NAPRA law that allowed all of the bones, the millions of them, in all of the different museums to be given back to the First Nations, the Native American peoples, and for them to rebury them in their own burial grounds. So we haven't got anything. There isn't any giant bones in North America that we can look at. So I'm afraid to say that we can't analyse them. What we can say is that some of the first peoples to arrive in the North American continent came from Siberia, the very same area where the Denisovan remains have been found.
If this is true, could this species have come from a much older lineage? Linda Mouton Howe shares her theory on how Denisovan DNA could have been genetically manipulated by the Anunnaki.
Why is it that the Denisovans went extinct and Neanderthalensis went extinct, leaving Cro-Magnon Homo sapien sapien to dominate planet Earth? Was that the objective of an extraterrestrial experiment? So maybe there is an overlap of other intelligences using this planet that is responsible for our confusion today, looking back through time, trying to understand who are we. And maybe this whole huge story about all of these different bloodlines has to do with genetic manipulation, that planet Earth has been used like a laboratory, but not by just one, who knows how many. And that we humans today, trying to understand who we are, and going back and looking at all these civilizations, I remember that I started going out and doing searches, like going to look at the map, where is this in Siberia, and realizing that where this cave is, and where this new brand of human was, is a place where there have been UFO stories in and around this area in Siberia for a long time. And I started thinking, wow, could this really truly be an example of one of these experiments that is being done by extraterrestrials? And the discovery reinforces this idea. It is a branch of humans that has an antecedent with something completely unknown.
This might explain how Homo sapiens have survived for as long as they have. Perhaps an ancient code has been embedded in our DNA. Andrew Collins suggests that the migration of the Denisovans also points to ancient areas considered as portals.
The earliest hybrid descendants of the Denisovans spread out from a central area, which was probably southern Siberia, and reached various wayward points in the planet. And they set them up as markers. They set them up as portals of contact and connection with the stars and with the other world, and possibly even what we might call today parallel dimensions. Now, where were these points? Places like Gobekli Tepe, or certainly the area around Gobekli Tepe in southeast Turkey, the area around Giza in Egypt, and other places like Stonehenge in England, certain places in obviously China, in India, etc., etc. They become points of communication, points of contact that people would be able to return to again and again and again.
Not only did they build all of these megalithic structures, but they built them in areas that we call vortex zones. These are areas where ley lines on the Earth, with the Earth's natural energy grid, cross one another. In ancient times, they were called dragon lines. Almost every one of these ancient structures is built on top of places where ley lines cross one another. That's important because where they cross one another, you have amazing electromagnetic waves being produced, hugely strong electromagnetic waves. And wherever you have electromagnetic waves that are that strong, you can basically have a tear, a rip in the electromagnetic membrane that separates this dimension from the next. And this is something that's accepted in modern day science. The only thing that's separating our dimension that we're sitting here talking in is an electromagnetic membrane. These were creatures who understood that, and they understood that by building these structures right on top of these areas, of which the Altai Mountains is one of them, they were able to basically create a tear in that membrane, and you can have momentary interaction between the dimensions.
There's a really interesting thing I came across in my research, because as you know, I research scientists and I research the work of intuitives, the whole spectrum. I'm looking for consistency. I'm looking for where there's validation from both sides. I was given the same story, that some of the great beings who come and teach throughout the cosmos to lift consciousness anywhere, it's just a job. That's what they do. They're not to be worshipped or heralded in any other way any more than you or I, but that's what they do. But there's a process they have to go through. There are other people who are those who come as masters and as teachers for planet Earth. And those people may be considered to be on the path to the sun. If you look at Sirius as what is considered the sun behind the sun, 20 times brighter, twice as large, this incredibly brilliant star, as the sun behind the sun, it takes on other meanings. One of them is that Sirius is also associated with Isis. So if you start looking at the genuine meaning of what Isis is, you go beyond all of these common identities to something primal, almost primordial, or prima materia, material, mater, mother. You go back to the mother energy, which is the source of physical creation of the entire universe, or universes. So if you take that look at it, and you look at Sirius as the sun behind the sun, what gives birth to the sun is the mother of the sun. So it would make perfect sense that Isis is associated with Sirius.
The fact that that relationship exists at all between two stellar bodies that are 8.7 light years away is an indication to us that that same relationship exists over the entire universe. And because they were responsible for developing our biology, they knew that that same mechanism existed within the human body, that they literally built within us the ability to control our own reality through it. This knowledge became the knowledge of all the ancient mystery schools, the knowledge of how to actually attune yourself to these frequencies in such a way that you can cause change in conformity with will. That's the great secret of magic practices, and what the Egyptian priesthood wanted forever to try to preserve, and have largely done so. The knowledge is still alive and well in a lot of different occult priesthoods around the world.
But why was this priesthood only preserving this knowledge for themselves? In 1353 BC, a pharaoh in the 18th dynasty named Akhenaten wanted to expose these secrets to his people. He wanted his people to only worship Aten, which was the disk of the sun.
I think he was following a very long tradition, a very long bloodline, and because of that, he also followed a very long spiritual tradition. The priesthood had gotten onto the fact that they're onto a good job here. It's a job creation scheme of dividing a central god into many, 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 many gods, which allows the people to worship all kinds of interesting things, but they have to talk to a central priesthood. Now, that's a great job creation scheme where you have someone inserting itself into the middle of a connection between you and the spiritual godhead. Akhenaten takes over and he says, you know what? I want to hurry speed things along a little bit. Why don't we just begin to remove the worship of all of these myriads of gods because people don't know what they're worshiping anymore? Let's concentrate on one focal point, which is the Aten, the center of all creation. And it's not because he forbade people to worship other gods. He didn't do that. What he did was saying, stop doing this, okay? I want you to focus on the important thing, the central issue, because if you can understand the central concept of the Aten, from there, you will empower yourself to understand the true nature of what the other gods are doing. We're going back to the drawing board here, and it also means we don't give them power to become intermediaries between us and the creative source, because you don't need an intermediary, let's face it. This is why he got into a lot of deep water and why there's a lot of public relations that were negatively aimed at him and why eventually there was a military coup that forced him out of power. He was trying to create monotheism for the sake of focusing people's spirituality back where it ought to be, not what it had to develop into, which essentially was a corrupted priesthood.
This wasn't the first mention of Aten in Egypt. Thousands of years earlier in the 12th dynasty, the first known reference to Aten the sun disk as a deity is in the story of Sinuhe. This reference suggests that the deceased king is described as rising as God to the heavens and uniting with the sun disk, the divine body merging with its maker. Could Akhenaten have had passed down knowledge from an older lineage?
When I spirit traveled to the 18th dynasty, my guides took me to the temple where Akhenaten and Nefertiti were, and we stood and listened to a conversation that they had. They were quite misshapen. Their heads were so elongated and their bodies were not of a normal human shape, and they seemed to be intent in their conversation about how important it was that they change the beliefs of the Egyptian people. Both Akhenaten and Nefertiti come from Sirius A. They are bringing their understanding, their lore to Egypt, basically as star beings. And to make that a bigger statement, we're all star beings. We all came in from different places. This is where they came in. They worshipped Aten, which was Sirius, the sun, and they wanted to bring that in because for him, he could see growing up in this environment that the Egyptian gods had much more power. I also was taken back to the Great Pyramid, and when my guides and I entered the pyramid, Anubis was standing guard, and he wasn't going to let us get by. And my guide spoke with him, and he stepped aside, and we went into the Queen's chamber where Ra was standing there waiting for us. And he told me that this was the connection or the portal to Sirius, and that it is the Queen's chamber that was used for transport to and from Sirius. Ra told me that Anubis was actually adopted by Osiris and Isis, and the adoption was because Anubis was not from the same place all the Egyptian gods came from. They are all from Orion. Anubis came from the Southern Cross, and when he was adopted, he took on the head and the shape of a dog so that he would emulate the dog star and be a part of that group of demigods and be accepted. He really wanted the acceptance of Ra and Osiris and Isis. So he became a part of the group by adapting this dog-like head.
I would argue in my research that there was a connection between these cultures that stems back way, way beyond what modern day historians have been able to trace. And the reason for that is not only the similarity between their pantheon of gods, but the similarity in the structures that they built. And that it all goes back to a much earlier time when maybe the Mesoamericans came from a completely different part of the world. What's fascinating about Osiris and Horus and Quetzalcoatl is their connection to the star Sirius. What you have with Quetzalcoatl is a god that has a twin brother with a dog head. He becomes the star Sirius, and he guards the sun through the underworld, much the same as Anubis was the guardian of the underworld.
This is a time of huge extinction of species are wiped out. The new evidence that is providing coherent sense to this is called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And it has been put forward by a large group of mainstream credentialed scientists. And what they've said is that they have found evidence which suggests the Earth was hit by several fragments of a comet. For a long time, the comet was out there. It was probably a very spectacular visual presence, but it wasn't hitting the Earth. But 12,800 years ago, by which time that comet had begun to fragment, had broken up into lots of fragments. And the estimates are that 4 of those fragments, 4 large fragments, hit the North American ice cap. It's literally beyond imagination. That instant of impact would have created so much heat that it would have melted large areas of the North American ice cap and sent the water flooding south. Then within a matter of days or weeks of that release of water, the freezing temperature has begun, and there's no more release of water. The world goes dry at that point and into a very deep, dark, frozen period accompanied by animal extinctions. The Younger Dryas lasts for 1,200 years. It lasts from 12,800 years ago to 11,600 years ago. And then something else really weird happens. The Earth's been in a deep freeze. Suddenly, 11,600 years ago, you get a second massive pulse of meltwater into the world ocean. One very strong suggestion is that the Earth intersected again with the debris stream of the same comet, and that there were further impacts 11,600 years ago. But those impacts were not on ice. Those impacts were entirely oceanic. You get big comet impacts in an ocean, and what you're going to get, as well as extraordinary tidal waves, what you're going to get is a massive amount of water vapor thrown up into the upper atmosphere. And that water vapor creates a greenhouse effect, which accounts for the very radical warming of the Earth. It has to be rather intriguing that that's the exact date, 11,600 years ago, that Gobekli Tepe is founded. And it has to be even more intriguing that 11,600 years ago is the exact date that Plato gives us for the destruction and disappearance beneath the flood of the ocean of the lost civilization of Atlantis.
If what Graham Hancock is telling us is true about the Younger Dryas, where can we see evidence elsewhere on the planet?
The flood also did sink many other areas of megalithic architecture, such as the gorgeous pyramid that we see in the Azores off the coast of Portugal, such as what we see around the coast of India, such as what we see in Japan, where you have sunken architecture down there. All kinds of stuff that's coming up that defies the conventional view.
As a matter of fact, just a couple of years ago, a little further away from Malta in the Sicily Channel was discovered a giant, absolutely nobody's disputing, man-made megalith lying on the bottom of the ocean. And that bit of ocean was covered by the rising sea levels more than 9,000 years ago, which makes it already 3,000 to 4,000 years older than the established date for the monumental temples on the island of Malta itself.
Some experts, like Jack Cary, have done some alternative research that might coincide with the science behind the Younger Dryas.
As far as the sunken pyramids go, in the oceans of the world, a lot of that can be tied to research being done by Dr. Courtney Brown and his group of very skilled remote viewers. And they're beginning to not only target what they described as being Atlantis, but through their remote viewings, they're beginning to ascertain that it was this very science that caused the downfall of the society, that they used it in such a way that it literally caused a destruction of the landmass, and that may have actually been part of some sort of conflict or war that was going on. The fact that there's just so many of them all around the world is what's fascinating. Humanity has not come together in any way, shape, or form the way we would want or hope or expect or love for it to do ever since the Tower of Babel, ever since we were spread all over the earth.
A conflict? What kind of conflict could Dr. Courtney Brown and his researchers be picking up on? Ancient texts from the Greek philosopher Plato explain in great detail the destruction of Atlantis by Zeus as payback for human arrogance. The legend describes the founder of the great city to be half god and half human, and ruled by Poseidon. As punishment for their immoral bankruptcy, Zeus sent a ball of fire to destroy the aquatic cities. The curator of the Joseph Campbell collection draws some parallels from Plato's story and a similar tale between two warring Sumerian gods.
It is very possible that the Greek story, the one we find in Plato about a lost continent, Atlantis, ruled over by Poseidon, the god of the oceans, that this has earlier roots. After all, storytellers in those times borrowed from other stories, and we can follow, it's called syncretic, the way information, images, and narratives move from one culture to another, particularly if they're relatively geographically close by, which in this case is true. Sure, Enki, the great god of the Sumerian traditions, could have been the Poseidon figure, and the destroyer god could have come from the Sumerian tradition. This is not only possible, it is likely. Zeus is the name we are familiar with from the Greek tradition that comes and punishes the people of Atlantis who have achieved so much because they started taking it for granted.
What could the people of Atlantis have taken for granted? How could they have become immorally bankrupt? Could this be another interpretation of a god figure striking down upon humans for knowing too much?
What I can tell you is that there is a recollection in Sumerian myth and tradition of a time before the flood, when a high civilization existed and when cities existed, and then the flood came and everything was reset and started again. So what's of interest to me in that is the recollection of the memory of something before the flood, something major, something important before the flood.
Could there be a connection between the Greek version of Atlantis and the Sumerian gods?
M'intéresse vraiment, mes travaux vraiment se focalisent tout particulièrement entre...
I think it is interesting because we thought for a long time that Plato had been taught by Egyptian priests. But thanks to the Edfu text, we wonder if he actually had the copies in hand. We will never know. But there are very similar elements between the Plato version of the Atlantis and the Egyptian Edfu text of Atlantis I translated. And we can understand, in a few words, that Osiris, who is considered to be the Sumerian god Enki, fled Mesopotamia to help start a new civilization. According to the doctrine of Enlil, and he flees to Atlantis and settles down on some islands in the Atlantic Ocean. This ancient territory is mentioned in some funerary texts, such as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. They call it La Mata, which can be roughly translated by the water crown of Ta. Ta is one of Osiris's names. It is the Egyptian name for Enki. Like all the other gods, he had many different names. We understand that Ta settles on some islands, and we can identify similar data to that of Plato's writings. In the Edfu versions of the Atlantis, there are always attacks from the forces of Set. Set is, of course, Enlil. We understand that he went all the way to Egypt, even all the way to Morocco, Azores, and the Canary Islands. Set doesn't stop attacking Osiris's islands. Another interesting element to this story, there is a technology that Egyptian gods used for protection, the Djed pillars. They place them around the city. Apparently, some are even on the water. The texts call them floaters. They can protect the city, and we can understand in parts of the text that thanks to the energy coming from these Djed pillars, Egyptians can control water and create water walls, very thick ones, in order to protect the city. Many mythologies and legends have similarities. We understand that Osiris could actually be Poseidon or Neptune, and Enlil, in some ways, could be Zeus.
What is interesting to note is Poseidon is always pictured with a pitchfork that was later connected with the biblical pitchfork of Satan by the Catholic Church. If Enki is connected to this interpretation, could the destruction of Atlantis be the story of Yahweh's wrath on advanced humanity? Anton Parks suggests there is a connection between the scientific version of the cataclysm and the Egyptian texts.
Assez régulièrement parce que en fait l'Atlantique.
The Egyptian Atlantis must have lasted long enough in history that it is part of Egyptian culture. Funerary texts mention it quite often. Indeed, the Egyptian Atlantis, La-Meta, corresponds to the west. It also means the west in Egyptian. And west is also where you bury the dead. We see that the idea remains that when you go towards the west, there were many deaths. In Egyptian history, Osiris's death happens at the same time as another very singular element, which takes place in the sky. It is the fall of the Eye of Sound found in the Edfu text. This is the destruction of a planet which was in between Mars and Jupiter. This is where we find the asteroid belt, and I believe that a planet used to be there. The death of Osiris is at this point in the story.
In 1950, Emanuel Velikovsky published a book called Worlds in Collision. In this book, he discusses that Venus was ejected from Jupiter as a comet and this passed near Earth, causing catastrophes mentioned in mythologies around the world. Could Anton's translations of the Sumerian text explain this very moment in human history and how it relates to the flood?
Selon moi, il s'agirait de...
In the Edfu text that I translated, they mention the fall of the Eye of Sound. Let me explain. In my opinion, Venus was located close to Mulgay. It was one of its satellites, and when Mulgay exploded, its satellite, Venus, is ejected into the solar system, and at some point, it comes very close to Earth. Then there is Osiris's death. According to the text, this was the work of Enlil, who prepared his attack, both on Earth and in the sky. He really wanted to make history and impact significantly the gods' history. He was not going to be defeated by earthly technology. Venus was ejected into the solar system, turns inside it for thousands of years, before eventually placing itself where it is today. Enlil must have really wanted to finally put an end to the lengthy war he was waging against Enki Osiris. And he came close with the death of Osiris.
Que lorsqu'Isis décide de faire revenir Osiris dans un nouveau corps qui sera le corps d'Horus, dans la Grande Pyramide.
But then a second event, the story tells us, and luckily for history in general, Osiris comes back as Horus and the battle can start again. There are many elements that explain these events and that describe how Horus arrives to destroy the evil of the world in order to avenge his father's death. This explains a similar catastrophic event that happened at the same time, such as the destruction of Atlantis. This arrival is most likely a comet, who is actually Horus, according to Sumerian text. And this is also when the so-called flood happened, about 10,000 years ago.
Could these ancient Sumerian texts be explaining a battle for the power over Earth? And the destruction not only on the planet, but in the sky? Ancient texts suggest that whoever survived this cataclysm survived to tell the story in Egypt.
Plato tells us where the story came from. It came from an ancestor in his family line, Solon, a famous Greek lawmaker, who visited Egypt around 600 BC. And in that visit, he encountered Egyptian priests who told him the story that there had been a high civilization in remote antiquity that had been destroyed in a cataclysm and submerged beneath the sea, that there were survivors. Some of those survivors came to Egypt and founded what would become the great civilization of Egypt in due course.
And with the great civilizations of Egypt came the Great Pyramid. Could this ancient knowledge that was now buried beneath the ocean floor have made a resurgence on the Earth's surface?
Well, the Great Pyramid, is a monument, but it's a geometrical monument, but in fact it's not a four-sided pyramid. It has a very slight concavity on each side, making it an eight-sided pyramid. Now, the minute you do this, you not only complicate the design tremendously, but it produces rather bizarre geometry.
This video is in association with Gaia.com. Go to Gaia.com/Fifth Kind for access to thousands of thought-provoking documentaries and original programs. Follow the links in the description below.
Only recently, Japanese scientists discovered another 70 images in the Nazca Desert by using drone technology. It is very possible that the knowledge of our relationship to the stars existed much earlier and was transmitted to the people of Nazca.